Soon or late, everyone comes to a place in this road of life where there is a fork at which he will pause, if he is prudent and thoughtful, and can consider which branch to follow. There are plenty of people who come to these diverging paths either without perceiving them or else without being stuck by their possible importance. Such people follow their noses, as we say, and the way they take becomes a matter of chance only. That may or may not lead to a goal worth seeking. The man who chooses his road, though, has this manifest advantage over the other, that the very act of pondering his course adds to his own powers, and even if his choice be a mistaken one, he is by that much better fitted to pursue it. As a youth, I had several occupations open to me, but I do not think I chose between them with any great difficulty, because there was inherent in me so strong a pull toward the study of plant life as a vocation that it was almost inevitable that opportunities in the professions, as an inventor, as an artist, or as a teacher, all of which I had open, would be passed by almost without consideration. The fork in my road came when I found myself making money. Some 15 years in California firmly established me as a nurseryman and brought me a generous and profitable business. Generally speaking, there is not a great fortune in raising and selling young trees, since the turnover is slow, the market variable, and tastes and fashions in trees undependable. But the very principle on which, from the first, I had based my operations began in time to result in large scales and generous profits. Large sales and generous profits. The principle of performing all my experiments and doing all my growing of seedlings and grafts and cuttings on a very large wholesale scale. My name, too, which I guarded jealously from the beginning, was a great asset to me, with a high cash value. In addition to the ordinary nursery business, I had many sales of new varieties and novelties that considerably augmented my income. It was quite apparent in the early 90s that I could amass a comfortable fortune as a developer of new trees and flowers and a salesman of nursery stock. The time was not far in the future, I could see, when I could be assured a generous competence, with all that money may bring to one. But I had two certain penalties looming ahead if I were to yield to this temptation to become rich. The first was that the nursery exacted from me time and energy in the mere business of advertising and selling my wares, that I was impatient to give it. The second was that money itself and the fine things it could buy would certainly turn my mind eventually from the hard work involved. The easy course would have been to follow the current of my swelling success, with a vague possibility that, when I was well-to-do, I could afford to experiment with plants without thought as to the expense of the work. But I was a long sight more interested in plant development than I was in money-making, and also I knew quite well that nature is an exacting mistress and a jealous teacher. She does not reveal herself wholly to the amateur or the dabbler, and she will not cooperate fully and generously with the man who takes her lessons or her work lightly. Sharp experiences emphasized this truth for me. I found my experiments interfered with by the demands of my business. 2 or 3 important experiments failed signally because I brought to them a diverted mind. People began to expect more of me, as a man of business, than they would have presumed to demand of a plant experimenter devoting himself to his researches. The temptation to make money, as I have said, was not an alluring one to me, but it did require some courage and firmness to cut myself off from my source of income and devote myself to plant breeding. That I exerted that firmness with myself and had that courage was, of course, the determining factor in my life, As a nurseryman, I would have succeeded in amassing some money and some local fame as a plant developer and experimenter, unfettered by considerations of money-making and unhindered by the demands a business necessarily would have made. I was freed. And as a free man, almost careless of wealth, power, and fame, I was enabled to become a contributor to the happiness and knowledge and richness of this earth to all mankind, for all time to come, and at the same time found, without seeking either, that money and power and fame all came to me, in measures undreamed of and unsought. From this gratifying experience, it seems to me safe to draw one conclusion, namely, that undivided loyalty to a worthy ideal is richer in its rewards than any selfish pursuit. The examples of this truth, of the truth of this observation, are to be found so unfailingly in life that they ought to lead us all to consider whether or not we might be influenced by them when we come to the fork in the road and have our own momentous decision to make. I need not have gone far for innumerable lessons in my own chosen school to point me to this same conclusion, and perhaps I was influenced unconsciously by those lessons in making my decision, for nature tells us one thing over and over again, and in every department of natural history emphasizes it so that, to the naturalist, it begins to be recognized as the one infallible and clear law of existence. It is that the individual is of no importance, while the race is of the first and highest and greatest importance. Looking back through history, I discover that the law operates in human affairs precisely as it does in plant or animal life. It is true that the fittest survive. Certain philosophers have from this drawn the conclusion that fitness should be striven for if we are to be happy. It seems to me this is sound reasoning as far as it helps us care for our bodies and improve our minds. But when fitness is taken to mean hardness, and hardness is taken to mean selfish ruthlessness, nature upsets the whole apple cart of thinkers like Nietzsche by declaring that men are not important, but that the race is supreme. Compare Lincoln and Napoleon, the one who thought mainly of and for others, and sacrificed himself to make an ideal into a fact, and the other who dreamed of himself as ruling the world and who ceased to be useful to France when he began to think that he was France. In the field or garden, in the wilderness or on the plain, nature is teaching us this lesson of humility and service in the individual in 1,000 ways. She puts the fact there, and if we won't look at it or understand it or apply it, that is our problem, and we will be the sufferers. Man alone of all nature's children thinks of himself as the center about which his world, little or large, revolves. But if he persists in this hallucination, he is certain to receive a shock that will waken him, or else he will come to grief in the end. I do not know of any single precept that I have learned from nature that has been of more importance to me in my life and work, nor of one that I believe is of more value to others. I was sometime acquiring it myself, in spite of the fact that it was so clearly before me all the while. As a young man, I probably thought Burbank was pretty necessary to the scheme of things, but as the years went on, I was shown that it was only what Burbank did for the good of the world that would live and be set down to his credit. I climbed down off the perch pretty quickly when I found I was exaggerating. A pedestal is an uncomfortable location, anyway. If you will look over the wise and the great and the useful, you will find them down close to the ground. In nature, you can find amazingly interesting statements of this law, that it is the whole group and not the individual that is important. The most striking examples are those in which the individual is actually penalized for his devotion to his kind, or where death follows the reproductive act, or such a defensive measure as in the case of the stinging bee. There are 2 or 3 insects I know of that must die when their progeny are ensured life. Certain shellfishes are killed when their young or their fellows build on them to keep the colony going. All annual plants give up their life to the life germ in their seeds, and these are only a few of the instances where self-sacrifice is obligatory and not optional. But from these clear lessons to those that we have to find by careful search and study, the law is universal. The mother's instinct to sacrifice herself for her child is based on this law. The great strength and vitality that goes from a plant into its seed and into the mechanism for distributing this seed and ensuring it at least a fair chance to find fertile soil is a less obvious instance, but the same ordinance and plan of nature is behind it. I believe there is no more interesting study in all life than this of the means and devices by which plants grow, protect, and disseminate their seeds. And hardly anyone could resist the lure of subject if he would take the pains to examine a few seed envelopes and watch for himself the process by which they are developed, and then utilized to sow the precious seed within. Most of us are perfectly familiar with the envelopes that are provided with burrs or claws or stickers arranged to help the seed attach itself to a passing animal or to the feathers of a bird and cling there until carried to some distant point. Then there are the bearded seeds, such as those of the barley, or what children call the foxtail, which have containers barbed so that they will actually dig themselves into the loose leaf mold or topsoil of their abiding place and hang on there quite tenaciously until the winter rains come and the seed germinates and takes root. Another variety of seeds and envelopes is covered with a coating of a sticky substance that adheres to that which it touches. Another, the envelopes that explode and shoot their seeds in every direction, sometimes so violently as to endanger an eye. Examine the red clover or oxalis plant when its pods are ripening. You will find them green in appearance and not, like beans or peas, changing color and drying up. The heat of the sun will draw on the moisture content of these red clover envelopes, and suddenly the fastenings of the long pods will give, and the hard little white seeds will fly out with such force that you can feel them hit cheek or hand. The process in the bean or pea is the same. The drying up of the pod, though it goes farther before the explosion occurs, with a twisting motion that actually gives some of the seeds the curve of a baseball pitcher. Still, other seeds, and in some cases the envelopes or fruits themselves, are winged, so that they will fly a considerable distance, borne by the breeze or even floating as they fall and scattering quite away. The gladiolus and the corypsis are just 2 of the great number of winged seeds, while the maple, the ash, and the elm tree have winged fruits. Closely akin to the winged seeds are those made to float on water, and many between the two will both float and fly. A sort that will interest children is the pepper pot variety of envelopes. Like those of the snapdragon, the poppy, or the tobacco plant, these have openings sometimes so nearly like a pepper pot or salt shaker that they would make excellent designs for silversmiths to follow. There are enough seeds in each pod of the tobacco plant to keep a family in smoking materials if they would all grow, and incidentally, if you can get a hold of a microscope, you would be amazed at the beauty of each seed, so tiny that it is like a grain of sand, and yet each a perfect little gem of beauty, bronze, flecked with gold, and shaped something like a Brazil nut. This employment of a small microscope, by the way, will add something to your life that you would not take a good deal for if you tried it. You set considerable store by the movies, but a microscope will open to you a world of beauty and interest the motion picture camera cannot reach. And right in your own garden, or the nearest park, or even in a window box or a flower pot, if that is the best you are able to do where you are. Another kind of seed container and another kind of seed is the tough variety, made so that it would take a burglar to get to it, and of such material that even the powerful juices of the stomach of an animal cannot disintegrate it. Plenty of seeds are eaten by animals and pass through their bodies without the slightest change. If the animal has wandered a few miles during the day, you can understand that the free ride the seed had, without the expense of a ticket, and with a comfortable berth all made up for with it, will land it somewhere where it can have a new chance to take root, and perhaps a better chance than the parent plant had. This, incidentally, is an interesting study in itself. The reason for the arrangement nature makes for distributing seed as widely as possible. There is, of course, the need for avoiding competition with its fellow seeds of the same variety, and the big showy plants that take lots of room will be found, usually to have devices for disseminating seed widely, whereas a rule, plants that can stand up in a crowded community, such as the California poppy and the Johnny Jump Up, are content to let their seeds fall in close. In a broader and more important sense, there is an excellent reason for this broadcasting of seed, and especially for the devices by which it is carried long distances, perhaps by animals or birds, or perhaps by floods and high winds. That is, the long experience some plants have had with the vicissitudes of existence and the constant, though slow, change that is going on all over the world in characters of soil, climate, temperature, moisture conditions, and the like. Many species have found their old homes rendered unlivable for them. They would have been wiped out, as I suppose a good many thousands or tens of thousands have been, probably, by some cataclysmic or epochal change. But if a few seeds even had reached distant areas or distant lands or other continents by this dispersion I'm speaking of and found root there, the species was preserved to assume the great task nature commits to us of carrying life on. It all comes back, you see, to the importance of the race. The individual is important to himself, and you will find innumerable interesting examples, some of which I've discussed already in these papers, by which individual plants are enabled to see themselves through a hard winter, or drought, or unfavorable conditions, or even visitations of plant sickness. But you will be forced in the end to the conclusion that it is for the sake of recreating itself in seed that the plant lives and struggles, and often sacrifices itself, that the species or the race is the main consideration, and that the great individual is, to nature, a mere pawn in the great game, a mere thread or bit of color in her immortal plan. Perhaps a naturalist with 70 years of work and observation behind him can be forgiven if he preaches a little, and it seems to me this is a good time to preach briefly on the theme of service. That is a vastly overworked term in our modern times, and is made to apply to salesmanship and slumming and about everything in between. But it is still a good word and a good idea to contemplate. I will bet a straw hat to a felt one that if you are tired of your job and discouraged with your life and down in the mouth about the way you are treated, you have got a little mixed about your importance to the scheme of things. But I will bet an entire new suit of clothes against a poor necktie that, if you are happy, capable, liked, and trusted, you're giving the world or your family or your employers or your employees a little more than is expected, or than you're paid for, or than you get back. I never knew a naturalist or a nature lover who was a pessimist, though I'll confess I have known quite a number of writers and professors and near scientists who were. I think that you have only to live with nature for a while and keep your eyes and ears and hearts and minds open to become impressed with the hopefulness and beauty and fairness of the scheme, to become, in other words, an optimist. There is nothing mysterious nor complicated about getting the right adjustment to your environment. If you can realize that you are important to the scheme only insofar as you contribute something to it, why, mercy on us, you will find a smile coming easy, a laugh second nature, and a cheerful, helpful word right at the tip of your tongue from morning till night. I know it is unfashionable to preach the doctrine of happiness and the value of unselfishness, and that I take tremendous risks of being set down as very ordinary. Well, I never thought much of the fashions anyways. And as for being ordinary, it runs in the family, and is the thing about the Burbanks and the Rosses and the Edisons and Jordans and Lindsays and Muirs and Burroughses and such tribes that I take the most joy in and feel the greatest pride about. So you will get small comfort from reading me out of the blue book on that score. Just a little while back, I had a letter, typical of many received during my lifetime, from a man who had read something I had said in print about gardening on a small lot, and who wrote that he had gone out and bought a hoe and a fork and some seeds, and was now raising all his own vegetables, and was beginning to branch out with flowers. That letter did me as much good as a tonic, because it showed for me, perhaps the 1,000,000th time, that an enthusiast for nature can wield a considerable influence in getting other folks to turn that way too. I do not think these papers will add greatly to the sum of human knowledge, since I am setting down in them very little that is new or heretofore unheard of. What I do hope is that they will awaken the interest of readers in nature and her processes, not only for the fascination and delight of the theme, but because of the lessons that the study must bring to your attention and the influences some of those lessons may have on the lives of my fellows and particularly of their children. And so I keep yielding to the temptation to tell you more of the miracles and marvels of nature as I have discovered or encountered them. And it seems to me important to say that what I am setting down here has come to me mostly through my own observations and experiments, or has been deduced from my own experiments with plant life. I have read omnivorously and over a very wide field, and I have learned from the work and reasoning of others. But I do not believe that there is a single fact or statement or conclusion in this series of papers that has not impressed itself on my mind either through actual contact or deliberation, or else through practical demonstration of statements made by others and tested by myself. From the beginning of my work, I was never skeptical, but I had to prove things. My lifelong adherence to the scientific principles enunciated by Charles Darwin was not the result of any hasty acceptance of his soundness. In fact, some of his theories I seriously doubted from my own slight experience. But as time went on, I had greater and greater opportunities of putting his theories to the test of garden, bed, and field row. And the older I have grown, the more firmly have I been convinced that he was the master that all the others and mere pupils like myself. A young man once wrote me asking which book he should read by Mendel, the great scientist who concerned himself with the problem of heredity and hereditary laws to inform himself of the scientific facts in the field. I wrote him in reply something like this: "My advice to you is to start Mendel by reading Darwin, and then let Mendel go and read more Darwin. And in one of my books, I used a somewhat similar sentence. Read Darwin first, and then read the modern Mendelists, and then go back to Darwin." I did this because I found many qualified scientists stating conclusions which I could not demonstrate nor use as a working basis, but found Darwin always measuring up to the tests and the facts and never fumbling nor going astray through a too close application to a favorite theory or a fixed notion. I had no fixed notions, except the single notion that nature was the final authority, and that the interpretations put upon her laws and practices and idiosyncrasies and apparent contradictions by scholars, scientists, and philosophers were only suggestive and seldom conclusive. Darwin appeals to me as an exception, but he used reason and logic and common sense in addition to research, experimentation, and analysis. And if he had to choose between a clear probability on the one hand and a closed door or negation on the other, he would state the clear probability as a safe assumption, and scientific enough to suit him. We give a good deal of attention to the wonder of the growth of the mind of a child, but it seems to me that the wonder does not cease with childhood. My own mind, I know, has grown day to day. I have seen myself lose intolerance, narrowness, bigotry, complacence, pride, and a whole bushel basket of other intellectual vices through my contact with nature and with men. And when you take weeds out of a garden, it gives you room to grow flowers. So, every time I lost a little self-satisfaction or arrogance, I could plant some broadness or love of my kind in the place, and after a while, the garden of my mind began to bloom and be fragrant, and I found myself better equipped for my work and more useful to myself and others as a consequence. The raw materials to make this growth possible, though, do not come from introspection or selfishness. They come from the application of lessons from without, the influence of the environment, repeating itself over and over again on the sensitive plate of the brain and being transformed there, as sunshine and foods are transformed in the leaf of the plant, into material for the beautifying of the mind and the enriching of the soul. You have it in your power only to keep the brain sensitive to impressions and the heart and mind and soul adaptable to growth. You have the power to vary, and the extent to which you utilize and benefit from that power depends on you and no one else.